God is with us. God's love unites us. God's purpose steadies us. God's Spirit comforts us. And in this hour, God's grace gathers us together that we may share our grief, comfort one another in our sorrow, surround this family with our support, strength, and encouragement, remember and celebrate the life of Roger Heimer, and worship the God of all creation. Welcome, friends. I'm Helen Hempfling, pastor here at First Christian Church, where the Heimers have generously shared their gifts and passion for ministry for nearly 2 decades. Sharing in leadership this afternoon is my partner in life and ministry, Bruce Irvin, who is friend and colleague of Roger and Nancy, and Jan Harrington, our music director of music, who always appreciated the way Roger's baritone voice added to our sanctuary choir. We count it a joy and honor to be with you today. Just a few housekeeping items. If you would take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. And also, if you need to use the facilities or a drinking fountain, they're just through the doors this direction and down the hallway and to your right. Because poetry, the poetry particularly of Wendell Berry, resonated so deeply with Roger, we begin with this reading.
The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When I despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Another poet, known simply as the psalmist, now calls us into a time of worship and praise. And so I invite you to join me in a responsive reading of Psalm 8, found in your hymnal on page 728. Please read the bold print and sing the response when Jan raises his hand. O Lord, our God,
how majestic is your name in all the earth.
You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants,
you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. Sing praise to God.
When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers,
the moon and the stars that you have established.
What are human beings that you are mindful of them?
Mortals that you care for,
Yet you have made them a little lower than God.
and crown them with glory and honor. Sing praise to God who reigns above, the God of all
You have given them dominion over the works of your hands.
their feet,
All sheep and oxen,
and also the beasts of the field,
the birds of the air and the fish of the sea.
whatever passes along the paths of the sea.
O Lord our God,
How majestic is your name in all the earth. Sing praise to God who reigns above, the God of all creation.
let us pray. Indeed, how majestic is your name, O God. And so on this day, especially on this day, we sing your praises, acknowledge your power, trust in your strength, and rest in your eternal wisdom. Minister to us now in our grief. Speak to our hearts a word of comfort. Touch us into hope by a truth spoken. Enfold us within the community that shares our sorrow. Fill us with the joy and peace that comes from your radiant light. Hear this, our prayer. Amen. As you are able, please stand and sing together.
may be seated. For millennia, the people of God have turned to the Scriptures for comfort and for guidance at times of loss and distress, and so it is to the Scriptures that we turn this afternoon, using selections that were found in Roger's notes or specifically mentioned by him in comments that he made, reading first selected verses from chapters 3 and 9 of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to seek, and a time to lose, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time for war, and a time for peace. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few people in it. A great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than might. Yet the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heeded. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one bungler destroys much good. Secondly, reading from the prophet Isaiah, the 42nd chapter, verses 5 through 10. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. Sing to the Lord a new song, his praise from the end of the earth. And then these words offered in the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, words with which Jesus defined his ministry. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The word of God for the people of God. We all have our stories about Roger, our special memories, our images, and we will have an opportunity later as we gather for refreshments to share those stories, and in the days and weeks ahead to continue to share those stories. Right now, we would like to hear from Roger's daughters and son as they share with us words of remembrance of their father.
Hello, I'm Julia, and I'm the eldest daughter of Roger and Nancy. I don't know why I thought this was going to be a good idea, but it is lovely to get this view of everybody up here, plus there. I have 3 portraits of Dad moments, and they all point to how my dad both wittingly and unwittingly bequeathed a complicated and useful ethos and faith to us, or at least these are how they got bequeathed to me. Not too long ago, Dad was grousing about something like having to fix the car. He was very diligent in taking care of the essentials, but that didn't mean he was cheery about it. I was there and commiserated, and he chuckled and said, "But someone wise once told me that life is mostly maintenance." Wow, I thought, that's pretty good. Who said that, I asked. You, he said. I think he knew he was going to catch me by surprise. He was wearing a pretty sly smile. I don't think he knew how incredibly wise he was to share that with me. He showed me how wonderful he was as a father, and even better as a fellow human. He actually listened to and remembered a moment that was most definitely my better self. And he reflected this better self back to me in a way that honored our shared paradoxical dilemma of trying to be good humans. My second dad portrait is about compost. Yes, garbage. No matter where we lived, Dad had a garden in varying stages of productivity and beauty, and he always had a compost pile. We're not talking plastic rotating Blooming Foods co-op barrel here. It was a pile. And it had stuff thrown on it. Compost piles don't work if there isn't a mishmash of stuff in them. They don't heat up and they don't produce rich humus unless there's a little of this and that and a little more of something else, and it should get turned over once in a while, I learned. It was just a messy heap that made us think before we pitched our fruit peels into the trash, but it was enough to demonstrate to me all the values that compost can teach. The value of garbage, of waste not, want not. The knowledge that life takes all kinds. The cycle of death and rebirth. So I propose, in memory of Roger Lee Heimer, a composting theology of life. Dad truly knew that the last shall be first, and that the prodigal apple peel shall become the beloved bounty. Finally, I will confess to you what I now suspect is genetic tendency to organize via pile. The last few days, I witnessed my sister heroically sift through the omnipresent piles that consistently marked the perimeters of Dad's domain. What she found was a compost pile of information and reflection, mixed into bills, charity causes, many of them donated to, news articles, magazines, crossword puzzles, and receipts were his notes about his board work, philosophy, poetic snippets, biographical reflections, letters, and even some full-blown sermons. In his ecumenical gathering of data and life information, my dad composted, throwing in the catalytic tidbits of himself. In some ways, these were just notes to himself, a kind of on-the-fly journaling. Some of these were just commentary and editorializing, and some, I think, were like love notes, and maybe argument notes, to us, the universe, his heritage, other thinkers, and also to a kind of God that is composed of very tangible minutiae in life. You may wonder about the fact that I'm not using the word God very much, but instead the word mystery or compost. It's not because I don't acknowledge Dad's long service to the church. Dad, despite moments of daughterly rebellion, was my first pastor. When I became impatient with the platitudes of the church, he pointed me to Ecclesiastes, a difficult book. This is the book of wisdom of the ignored, of the lost, the poor wise man who saves the city, the forgotten. Sorry, lost my place. When I became frustrated with the New Testament proscriptions, he pointed me to the difficult prescriptions of what Jesus did in the world. He pointed to the poetry. Dad both loved and was bewildered by poetry. He would ask me if I really meant such and such line to mean 3 different things, and honestly, I felt a little exasperated at this. I mean, I'm a poet, and multiple meanings are my stock in trade. But I think this was less a critique, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, than his continued baffled wonder at how multifaceted and metaphoric the mystery of evolving belief is. Despite his worst fears and his best hopes, mystery exists, and it points us simultaneously to both sorrow and joy. Sorrow for how dense and selfish this world and we can be, and joy in the beauty that inhabits our active, hands-on love. I'm going to end with a question mark. Dad loved his puzzles and his crosswords. There were still half-filled in Sudoku and crosswords in the piles, and we had to cull most of them out. But we know that Dad's best puzzles were his existential puzzles, and these are gathered together within us. They're turned and watered through our good works in the world, planted in our souls, in the dust of our DNA, our doubts and our dreams. So, can you and I remember to recognize, learn from, and love the forgotten, messy, puzzling bits and beings around us today and every day forward? In honor of the Reverend Roger Lee Heimer, my dad, and the God he served.
Much like Julie's sentiment, I'm not sure this was a good idea for me to try to do this, but out of love and respect for my dad, I will give it a shot.
What's your name?
I'm Drew Heimer, Roger's son. Much like many small boys, when I was young and my dad was preaching in Minneapolis, I wanted to imitate him. I would get a long dress coat and a fedora hat, had the flip-down ear warmers to keep me warm in the cold Minnesota winters. I had my shiny dress shoes, and I would put on his big shiny shoes and think, someday my feet will be that big. My feet may be that big, but I don't think I'll ever fill his shoes. His love for us was very apparent when we were little. My sister and I would hear his car pull up. We'd dash through the house, run into the coat closet, giggling and shuffling, trying to hide behind the coats, waiting for him to come in and put his coat and hat away. And we'd blast out of the back of the closet to scare him, and no matter how many times that scene played out, which had to be daily for years on end, he always pretended like it was a total shock and surprise and would step back and act like he had to gather his wits. Of course, sometimes he'd turn the tables on us and forget to put his coat away for a while. There we would sit in the closet waiting for him patiently, but it was that gentle and loving heart that guided him through life. His attention and genuine concern for the overlooked, underprivileged, and hungry were his passion. Just the way he interacted with people on a daily basis was just his way of sharing light. One time when they were visiting, they used to come to visit us, and we would get carry-out food to make the visit a little bit easier for those of us that were at home. And on one of those trips, we went to go gather the food as we would do, and I'm in the car being a front seat driver, prepared for where I know the car is going to go, and the car turns into the parking spot, and I shift into the seat and realize we're pulling into the parking spot to go inside instead of going through the drive-up. I asked my dad, we could easily go through the drive-up. Why are we going inside? And he shared with me just simple words. I prefer to interact with people face to face. It's just the way he was, sharing a little bit of light along the way. And as simple as that sounds, I try to carry on that tradition, sharing that light with the people that I cross. The other thing that's just overwhelming at the moment is this is his place. For me, this place. And I feel his loss greatly. That's all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am the littlest, Lucy, and we want to thank you all for making the time and the journey to be with us today. I too will do my best. Wait a minute now. That was Dad, always checking to see if we got it right or he got it right. I can hear his voice and jingle of keys as he bursts back through the door after we thought he'd already zoomed down the street, as always, late to a meeting. As a young girl, he'd catch me, as my brother mentioned, and give me airplane rides far beyond when it was safe to catch an extremely tall, large baby girl. As I grew, my head would touch the ceiling when I sat upon his shoulders. Making us laugh brought him joy, even when requiring increasing strength. Later, he would drive my friends and me to the mall and stop for Burger King, building castles with the boxes while we teens gossiped and giggled. The All Things Considered theme song plays in my mind as I think of all the rides home from school. He patiently taught me to drive on a manual transmission up and down the boulevard. As he explained how the gears would engage as I struggled with releasing the clutch, stall, and stall, and stall. But he always painted that picture for me to help me wrap my head around what it was I was trying to do. Wait a minute now. When I was 9, there was a major tornado in Louisville. As we listened to the radio in the basement under a card table, to my mother's horror, my dad ran into the street to catch a glimpse of this amazing phenomenon. He loved to be immersed in and fully experience every curiosity. Similarly, during a recent drive back from Indiana with my family, we realized we were right in the path of a tornado, and my first thought was to outrun it. But instead, we quickly pulled off. As I huddled in a toilet stall with my 2 girls and fluffy dog, along with around 20 other women, I called my dad, and he jumped into action, checking the weather and alerts. I heard both fear and pride in his voice as he was impressed that I knew what to do. I loved making him proud. Each adventure I journeyed on, he'd sidle up beside me, throwing in wisdom and anecdotes. We drove to Chicago, Crown Point, New Mexico, with music playing, stopping, of course, at roadside attractions, windows down, up to northern Wisconsin, where I landed a teaching job. He always stayed long enough to hold me in safety until he could push, release, and watch my journey arc while I enjoyed the ride and landed on my next adventure. I remember one conversation after 3 days traveling together when he asked the waitress, wait a minute now, requesting more details about the special or who knows what. And though I was impatient, he wisely pointed out that perhaps it's the niggling frustrations we feel about those we love that mirror something important about our own ways of being in the world. My dad saw me for who I am. He showed up for me. He celebrated me. He loved me. I was indeed truly seen. I'll end with sharing insight from a quote I found in the piles and piles that Julia mentioned from one of Dad's sermons tucked in there. He said, "So if I have anything uniquely helpful to say as testimony about prayer, it is this: treasure the hymns you know. Many are the best prayers of the ages." So what does it say that on his last day, as he was looking for comfort, he asked that I sing a lullaby I had sung to my girls? I blanked. I could think of nothing. It had been a long day, a painful day, and all that came to mind was a made-up tune I sang where we inserted each family member's name in repetition, adding at the end, "We love you." Perhaps that was my deepest, truest prayer in that moment, to remind my dad of the life and love he created and his immeasurable legacy. Thank you.
Where did you get your moral earnestness? That was the question that a teacher put to Roger Heimer in the early 1950s, when a young man with a thirst for knowledge was beginning to explore where his sharp mind might take him. Raised on a farm in eastern Nebraska, where his pioneer forebears had transformed the tall grass prairie into rich farmland, he learned early the virtues of hard work and cooperation and honesty. Well, that's a pretty good foundation for moral earnestness right there, it seems to me. But Roger's adventurous spirit was already gazing beyond the tree-lined creeks and the rolling hills of the Great Plains. He had a thirst for knowledge that would send him on to seminary and ministry and a lifelong yearning for truth. That's truth with a capital T. It wasn't just the facts on the surface that interested Roger, it was also and especially the knowledge beneath the knowledge that he searched for, that he thirsted after, that he absorbed like the roots of a tree stretching out through the prairie sod, sucking up whatever moisture it can find. Like the biblical tree of knowledge paradoxically referenced in Genesis, Roger absorbed every bit of wisdom that he could. He was boundlessly curious. He very much respected what we humans can discover with our minds. Through his reading and his conversations, his observations of both nature and society, his adventures driving off into the middle of nowhere to see and experience something new with family along for the ride, whether they liked it or not. In all of these ways, he absorbed knowledge into his constantly active mind, passing it through rigorous filters of reason and analysis, holding himself and others and all of the data that he was processing to a very high standard, doing all of this before something could be accepted as truth. It is no wonder that Roger resonated with the words of Dr. Edward Scribner Ames, the Dean of Disciples of Christ Liberals in the first half of the 20th century, words that are printed on the bookmark that you all have received in your bulletins. Dr. Ames, who sought to make religion as intelligent as science. Roger stood very much within that tradition of disciples rationalists going back through Ames all of the way to Alexander Campbell. Where did you get your moral earnestness? The teacher asked Roger. That earnestness was applied to what is true, and it was applied to what is right. As Roger's understanding of the gospel deepened in his college and seminary years, he was drawn especially to the social gospel, which has to do with the ethics of Jesus as applied to the injustices of modern industrial society. And the biblical touchstone here for Roger and for many social gospel advocates is surely Luke 4, especially verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, release to the captives, liberty to the oppressed. But here again, one has to understand how Roger's passion for justice was rooted in the culture of the Great Plains, where families helped each other with planting and with harvesting and with barn raisings, where farmers banded together in grain co-ops, sharing the wealth of the land rather than paying big bucks to the operators of private grain elevators, where public power authorities brought electricity to the towns and farms that dot the rural landscape. The Nebraska farmers who support such cooperative endeavors to this day are like the wise ones in Ecclesiastes, who offer words of far greater wisdom than the shouting of a ruler among fools. For Roger, it was a natural progression